No doubt mass and numbers do matter. We'd had, of course, conscription during the Second World War. Everybody had been called up, or if they weren't called up for the military, they went down the mines or whatever they did. And it made sense to keep those numbers up. And
So then the Prime Minister is reportedly planning to urge employers to prioritise applications from those who have served in the military. Rishi Sunak's expected to continue advocating his plans for reviving something like national service. Over the weekend, he said all 18-year-olds would be made to undertake a form of mandatory national service if the Conservatives are re-elected on the 4th of July. So these dividing lines are opening up on security, aren't they? Let's speak to Lord West. That's Alan West, former Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff, and indeed former Labour Security Minister. Lord West, good afternoon.
good afternoon.
Very good to speak to you. So then, on national service, which Keir Starmer has criticised this morning, calling it a teenage dad's army. Is that fair?
Well, I think I always like the thought that youngsters will get an interest in defence and big issues for the nation, rather than small identity issues that seem to be tying everyone up nowadays. But I don't think this is the way to do it. To suddenly come up and propose, well, they haven't really made a full proposal, but to sort of say we'll be recruiting 30,000 18-year-olds and others will go and do this, that, and the other, I think is ill thought through. There's no doubt there are real costs involved from the military in training youngsters of 18, and they'll only be doing it for a year. There'll need to be extra accommodation, there'll need to be trainers, and they'll come out of our regular forces. These things, you can't do them easily. And what we really need is more money for defence. Now, I thought that the Tories had understood that at long last. It's taken them long enough with their last announcement about going to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. But an idea like this with conscription will suck up a great amount of that money prior to the money really appearing within our budget.
Well, so why did national service? Why was it a good thing from 1947 to 1960? Why was it a good thing then, but it wouldn't be a good thing now?
Well, I think at that stage we still thought there might be a global world war against the Soviet Union, and there's no doubt mass and numbers do matter. We'd had, of course, conscription during the Second World War. Everybody had been called up, or if they weren't called up for the military, they went down the mines or whatever they did. And it made sense to keep those numbers up. And we still had a training pipeline and mechanism in place to train those vast numbers. The military was much bigger. We had the accommodation. You can't remember, you're much too young, but all over the country there were military sites and camps and things like that. And it was a matter of just slotting them into those and keeping the training going. But we began to realize that actually they weren't able to be trained to the level that we really needed them. Warfare was changing, and that's why we went away from the idea of conscription.
Okay, it's a fascinating one, isn't it? Really, because you can see some argument on the face of it as to getting numbers up, getting young people into the army. 30,000 new beds for the scheme is a question that Labour have asked as to how the Ministry of Defence would actually fund these things. But actually taking all of what you've said into consideration, Lord West, I wonder if Sir Keir Starmer's plans have any more credibility in your view. This idea of a security review to be carried out in 100 days, doesn't that feel quite quick to review the entirety of the UK's security position?
Well, I'd split the two things out. I mean, I'm not sure what his plan is in terms of anything like conscription or anything like that. I just don't know if there are any. I mean, what I would suggest in that area is much greater use of reserves and using a limited number of reservists to train up what's known as the third echelon of the army, which gives it that extra capacity of people, much cheaper and could be done. But I don't know. I have no idea I'm afraid, what Labour are doing on that. As regards the overall security, I was, as you rightly say, security minister and counter-terrorist minister from 2007, not long after 9/11. And we did effectively have that big review. We formed an organisation called the OSCT, which I think now is called within the government Homeland Security. We did look at all of those issues and came up with a plan across government to do things. And I hope that some of that is still in place, but there's no harm in regularly looking at it. And you need to have every department of government involved in it. And we did achieve that during that period. And indeed, during that period, 2007 to 10, we actually reduced the threat levels to the country. So I think there's merit in looking at it, and that's primarily on the terrorist and internal threats to the nation, rather than talking about making a larger set of armed forces and things like that.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's going to be something of a deficit in Sir Keir Starmer's defence and security announcements throughout the course of this campaign, some of which are kind of floating around today, given that Jeremy Corbyn wanted to abolish the armed forces, to scrap the nuclear deterrent, to withdraw from NATO, and that Keir Starmer campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn, in fact saying he'd be a great Prime Minister. Does he have something of a deficit to make up in this area?
Well, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, I have to say, was totally deluded in terms of his ideas on defence.
Well,
and
Keir
his
Starmer didn't think so a few years ago, did he?
But in terms of Keir Starmer's support for him, I'm not aware of how closely what their views were and things like this. But you're quite right about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I actually wrote in the papers just before the election, "Don't vote for this man. He doesn't love our nation, and he's very deluded about how we look after ourselves."
Yeah, it's really good to speak to you, Lord West. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord West, former Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff and a former Labour Security Minister. So then, as we report for you these kind of opening, dividing lines between the parties this afternoon, what do you make of it? National Service still getting your attention. Keith in Glossop says, why does the media continue playing along with this fantasy National Service distraction? Ask the Tories about their actual performance and actual policies. Well, I mean, in our defence, Keith, this is something that the Prime Minister's announced, that he is floating as an election policy, as an election commitment. So I don't know. I mean, fantasy is an interesting word to use in that context. I mean, I take your point. There's lots to ask about, their actual performance. But this is something they've announced. That's why we're talking about it. Charlie says, hi Callum, I think I'd rather trust a man who has changed his party for the better than a man who supported and defended a rule-breaking Prime Minister and seems intent on driving division. So Charlie drawing the battle lines, I suppose, really there between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in this general election campaign. To Matt Dathan, Home Affairs editor at The Times, who reported exclusively on Labour's election commitments on security for you on the front page of The Times this morning. Hi there, Matt.
Good afternoon.
Hi, good to speak to you. So then, Sir Keir Starmer has been focusing on the importance of economic, border and national security as well. Interestingly, he kind of accused the Tories of not actually believing in those principles anymore. So I'm just wondering if this is fertile ground, I suppose, for these election campaign dividing lines to be drawn.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Rishi Sunak last week tried to make the dividing line very much on national security, saying that who can you trust on national security? Is it really a Labour Party led by a man who served under Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years, who didn't stand up to Russia, doesn't believe in NATO, etc. And this was Starmer really trying to get ahead of those attacks that he expects all of the campaign by basically making very clear in his first keynote speech that he has fundamentally and permanently changed the Labour Party, and therefore he can also do it for the country, and he can be trusted because of his track record over the last 4 years, not the previous 4 years working for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. In terms of what you were reporting this morning then, Matt, this is on the concept of a security sprint. So just explain to us what that is and how it works, particularly in a government context, because it is borrowed from elsewhere, isn't it, this idea?
Yeah, it's very much borrowed from the private sector, but also the US government quite recently has taken part in these rapid security reviews, where basically, rather than tasking each agent of the government, so each government department and an MI5, the police, for example, to come up with their own security plans, you basically get them all in one room with a very tight deadline and say, you've got to come up, identify the threats within 100 days of a Labour government. And then the Labour government would then come up with its policy and solutions for tackling those threats. It was very much Vivek Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, saying they want to emulate what they did post 9/11 with the contest strategy, which was the counter-terrorism strategy to respond to that new threat post 9/11 of Islamic extremism turning into a very violent and national security threat. And she's arguing that today's threats are more like those threats from hostile states, from generative AI, which are generating terrorist chatbots, for example, cybercrime and extremism, which is being the Middle Eastern war at the moment is a breeding ground for that extremism in the UK population. So that's what the security sprint is all about for the Labour Party.
And then in your analysis, Matt, in terms of the actual impact that a security sprint, as you've outlined, could have, just to put to you, a senior Conservative Party source reported in the Times saying, uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. In uncertain times, Labour would call for a review, crossing their fingers and hoping Britain is safe until someone else decides the action they should take. With your Home Affairs editor hat on here, Matt, is that a fair criticism, or is actually this idea from Labour quite a sensible one? It kind of removes a lot of the bureaucracy that can sometimes exist around these sorts of reviews and lets them kind of get at action quite quickly.
Well, I think for Labour, I mean, they've not been in government for the last 14 years, so they don't have that direct insight needed necessarily to identify the specific threats. They don't have that very recent experience of working with the agencies as they are now, so they don't have that recent experience. But their argument is on the Labour side that the Tories have not tackled these threats head on with the urgency needed, and the Strategic Defence Review, etc., Security Review is out of date. They've been distracted by internal politics and obviously by other issues like the COVID pandemic, for example, by Brexit. And this security review is basically a message they're trying to send to the country that they would put national security front and centre of the priority in the Home Office, and within 100 days they would have drawn up a plan for how to tackle the biggest threats facing Britain.
Matt, really good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Matt Dathan, Home Affairs editor at The Times.